he got to live 56 more years than Dr. King. As I said, they were the same age. And I think that the work he did in those 56 years against police brutality, for economic justice, equal education, immigrants' rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, he was involved in all of that. And he did that until the day he died.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Fox Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of The Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. You can find out more about us, including how to support our efforts, at our website, theprogressivesouth.org. My interview this week is with Emily Yellin, who you heard up top. She's a journalist and author who has a great new book out that she wrote in collaboration with the Reverend James Lawson Jr., a significant but under-recognized figure in the civil rights movement. Lawson passed away in 2024, but in the years before he died, Yellin worked with him on his life story, which has just been published by Penguin Random House with the title Nonviolent. That conversation is coming up. And in our arts and culture segment, we'll check in on the great North Carolina music festival MerleFest coming up this weekend. But first, the news roundup. As always, you can find links with sources and more information in the show notes. This week, we're talking about someone who needs no introduction and who, frankly, a lot of us are probably sick of hearing about. But he continues to have an outsized impact globally, nationally, and also specifically in several southern states. Yes, I mean Elon Musk, the theoretical richest man in the world. I say theoretical because so much of his wealth is in stocks with values that can fluctuate widely. But he's worth an estimated $840 billion or so at the moment, and in the near future he may become the world's first trillionaire. That gives him a lot of power, obviously, and that power is compounded in the United States by his close ties to the current Republican Party. One result is that in Republican-dominated states, including much of the South, the political leadership tends to be deferential to Musk, if not outright subservient to him. And he's taken advantage of that in several ways. For example, let's take a look at Austin, Texas, where Musk's Tesla company opened a manufacturing plant in 2021. Gigafactory Texas, as the facility is known, was originally projected to employ 60,000 people, and in return received a local tax break of up to 80% off its property tax bills. The incentive is worth about $14 million over 10 years. But the factory has never come anywhere close to 60,000 employees, peaking at a bit over 20,000 employees before a slowdown in Tesla sales led to job cuts in 2024 that was one of the largest mass layoffs in Austin history, and even further cuts in 2025. By the end of last year, there were about 16,500 employees at the plant. Meanwhile, the Texas Tribune reported last week that the plant continues to increase its water usage, surging to about 550 million gallons last year, making it the third largest customer of Austin Water, the city-owned local utility. This growing demand from Tesla has come as Central Texas is experiencing an ongoing drought, compounded by the growth of the Austin metro area in recent decades. Local residents are currently under water use restrictions that limit them to watering their lawns or gardens no more than twice a week, and those rules could become more severe if the area moves from a Stage 3 to Stage 4 drought, as many experts predict. Paul DeFiore, an environmental attorney who sits on an Austin Water task force, told the Tribune, quote, "It's extremely alarming. All of a sudden they're using more water than the vast majority of people in the city," unquote. None of that has hampered Musk's plans to add even more demand to the system. In March, he announced a forthcoming semiconductor fabrication plant near the existing factory, which will require even more water, potentially billions of gallons a year. Water is also an issue at another Musk project, the controversial XAI data center in Memphis, Tennessee. We've talked about this before in the context of air pollution associated with gas turbines that Musk built, apparently illegally, to help power the massive computing facility, which is aptly named Colossus. But Colossus also requires water, lots of it, to keep the supercomputer from overheating. The original plans for the project that Musk and his team presented to state and local officials called for a huge water recycling plant to allow it to reuse the same water over and over and minimize its impact on local resources. But on April 9th, local Memphis media reported that company officials said the water plant was paused indefinitely while work continues on building the second phase of the project, known as Colossus 2. XAI and Musk said they weren't canceling plans for water recycling, just delaying them while proceeding with, quote, more immediate projects at the site, unquote. In at least the near term, though, that means the plant will be drawing billions of gallons a year directly from the same aquifer that serves the residents and other businesses of the Memphis metro area. Memphis Mayor Paul Young, who has supported XAI despite the opposition of many local residents and environmental organizations, posted concerns about the delay, saying, quote, promises to this community are not optional. A wastewater facility is about protecting our water and our future. I will continue pressing XAI to deliver, unquote. Despite all of that, in the last 2 months, XAI has gone ahead and filed for local permits for its Colossus 2 expansion plans. Meanwhile, just 2 miles across the Mississippi state line from Memphis, another XAI data center is also facing complaints about air pollution and gas turbines. The company's new center under construction in South Haven, Mississippi, was heralded in a press release this past January by Governor Tate Reeves, who said it, quote, sets the pace for continued high-tech investments across our state and strengthens Mississippi's position as a leader in this exciting tech revolution, unquote. Of course, as we've talked about here before, data centers are not in and of themselves great economic drivers. They can employ hundreds of people during construction, but once they're up and running, they have small staffs relative to their outsized impact on local utilities and the environment. And those impacts are already showing up in South Haven. As at the center in Memphis, thermal imaging with drones has shown more than a dozen gas turbines operating from flatbed trailers at the site, all without state permits. State regulators have said the turbines being on trailers makes them temporary and therefore not in need of air pollution permits. But the Environmental Protection Agency has already ruled against that interpretation in Memphis. In an investigation by the climate-focused journalism site Floodlight, former EPA Air Enforcement Chief Bruce Buckheit said the Mississippi turbines are in clear violation of federal law. XAI did not respond to the outlet's request for comment. The NAACP filed a lawsuit last week against XAI over the operation of those turbines. And air and water aren't the only elements Musk is disturbing in his marauding across the South. In Nashville, local residents are worried about the ground, too. Specifically, the limestone underlying what geologists call the Nashville Basin, and all of the buildings and infrastructure that sit on top of it. Last year, Musk and state Republican officials announced with much hoopla something called the Music City Loop, an underground tunnel that is planned to run between downtown Nashville and the city's airport about 13 miles to the east. It's modeled on an existing loop built in Las Vegas by Musk and his boring company. That's the name, capital B for boring, as in tunneling. Like that one, the Nashville Loop will be for the use only of chartered Teslas, which will drive paying customers into town or out to the airport and bypass the often congested local interstates. It was announced with almost no serious planning or analysis of the underlying terrain. The state granted the company permission to start digging from a state-owned site downtown, and work commenced almost immediately. Nashville residents and city officials have raised questions and concerns ever since about both the benefits of the loop, which they say will mostly serve tourists, and the potential complications of constructing such a long tunnel beneath densely populated areas and busy highways. Among other things, they have cited more than 800 environmental violations allegedly committed by the boring company in its Las Vegas project. In March, the Nashville Metro Council approved a resolution opposing the project on a 20-15 vote. But the locals have little authority over the loop, which is mostly using state right-of-way. And last week, the Tennessee General Assembly voted to create a new state board just to oversee the project, with all members appointed by the state's Republican leaders. During discussion of the bill, Democratic State Representative Justin Jones of Nashville said, quote, "We are bending state law to serve the whims of one man against the interests of Nashville." Now we're to my conversation with Emily Yellin. She's a journalist, author, and producer. She was born in White Plains, New York, but grew up in Memphis. She graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a degree in English literature and received a master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University. She's lived in New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, and London, but eventually returned to Memphis, where she lives now. She led a multimedia journalism project centered around in-depth video interviews with some of the Memphis sanitation workers who went on strike in 1968 and their wives, sons, and daughters. That resulted in a 10-part video series called 1,300 Men, Memphis Strike 68, produced in partnership with The Root that was posted during the first 4 months of 2018, coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the Memphis sanitation strike. You can find a link to that in the show notes. Yellin is a longtime contributor to the New York Times, mostly writing about the South, race, and women's issues. She's also written for Time, The Washington Post, and many other publications, and is the author of 2 previous books, Your Call Is Not That Important to Us, published in 2009, and Our Mother's War, published in 2004. Her latest book, Nonviolent, a memoir of resistance, agitation, and love, is a collaboration with civil rights movement leader Reverend James Lawson Jr. They worked together for 5 years to write his story before he passed away in 2024 at the age of 95. It's a thoughtful and compelling first-person account of the civil rights movement, not just its main actors and events, many of which Lawson was part of, but also its animating ideas and philosophy. As the title of the book suggests, Lawson was one of the leading advocates and teachers of nonviolence in the movement. I talked about all of that with Yellin, as well as how the book and Lawson's work provides perspective on our current moment. It was a great conversation. It's a little on the longer side, but all of it is valuable, and I really enjoyed it. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. Okay, Emily Yellin, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
So I thought we could start by just talking a little bit about the background of this book. Reverend Lawson may be a well-known name to people who are sort of scholars of the civil rights movement, but not, among the names that leaps immediately to mind when people talk about it. Can you just kind of start by telling us a little bit about him and then about your own connection to him, which I know goes back a long way, and how that eventually led to this project of the book that you worked on together?
Yeah. So Reverend Lawson, John Lewis, who many people do know, Reverend Lawson was his mentor, and he called Reverend Lawson the architect of the nonviolent movement in America. And what he meant by that was Reverend Lawson and Martin Luther King were the same age. They had similar backgrounds, although they were from very different places. Martin Luther King was Southern. Reverend Lawson was the child of 2 immigrants. His father was from Canada, his mother was from Jamaica, and he grew up in Ohio. And he was a Methodist minister where King was Baptist and Southern. And so they were different, but their commitment to leading with love, the beloved community, that concept that instead of dominating and being cruel, that we lift everyone up together and are collaborative. That was the driving force behind Reverend Lawson's whole life. And he had particular experience with using nonviolence to get there. So before he met Martin Luther King in 1957, he had already been to India. He had traveled through Africa and met with the leaders of the independence movements in Africa who were trying to throw off the colonial European rule and were successful ultimately, but he met them before they had even done that. And so he was very grounded in anti-colonialism, in the idea of that no one is free till everyone's free, which is a Fannie Lou Hamer quote. A lot of the things that became the civil rights movement, he was already grounded in that. There was a man named Howard Thurman who was one of his mentors, and also Bayard Rustin was 20 years older than Reverend Lawson and was one of his mentors. And they both were very committed to this idea that the way that we have to go is as a world lifting each other up and uh, embracing the idea that all of us are here together. Now, what they also saw, and they were all Black men, is they saw and lived and were Americans and lived in a society which was not democratic and which was not living up to the ideals of the founding documents. Reverend Lawson considered those documents to be sacred. And so he brought to the civil rights movement, King invited him to come down south when he met him. And he brought a lot of that experience to the movement. And King said, you have to come now. Reverend Lawson was at Oberlin in graduate school by the time he met King, and they were both in their late 20s. And King said, you have to come now because we don't have anybody like you. And Reverend Lawson came down, and one of the first things he did, he moved to Nashville. He dropped out of Oberlin, moved to Nashville, and he met with the Little Rock Nine in 1958, their second semester. He met with them in Little Rock in Daisy Bates' living room. And Reverend Lawson had always felt he was going to come south because he knew that he wanted to be part of this movement that he had sort of envisioned before it even started. He almost had a prophetic idea of it. There's a letter he writes in 1951 to a friend saying, I don't understand why Black people in the South can't rise up and fight segregation together. And they probably have to do it, through something like nonviolence. And there probably have to be some sort of iconic leader. And I'm really sure this is going to happen and I'm going to be part of it, which is kind of amazing. When I saw that letter, I was just blown away. And then it happened. And as I said, he went to Little Rock. One of the first things he did in 1958 when he got to Nashville and was in the South now. And he met with the Little Rock Nine, and they told him that they had been told not to fight back, that no matter what was happening to him, don't fight back. And he got really angry. And he was angry at the leaders in Little Rock who had told them that. But he didn't express it to them or outwardly, but he said to them, I think what they mean is you have to fight back. You are being abused. And if you don't, understand your anger, recognize it's legitimate, and fight back, it will do something to your spirit for the rest of your life. And so what he said, though, was what I think they're saying is you can't fight back in the same way that they are oppressing you. So he considered racism violence. He considered unequal education violence. He considered, many of the things that we sort of think of as issues. He considered them violence, poverty, enforced poverty. He considered that violence. And so his point to the Little Rock Nine was, when in a situation where there's state-sponsored violence, you don't have equal footing. You just don't. And so if you use the same tactics and the same ways, you're not going to win. So it's really almost at first a practical thing. And so you have your wits, you have your creativity, and you have your imagination, and you have your community. And so those are the tools that he and Dr. King and the movement was actually based on. And he encouraged them to do that, to understand that they were doing something that was right, and they were doing it for people, not just themselves, but everyone. And that kind of, moral clarity is something that he brought in a way that I would maintain. And actually Dr. King and John Lewis in effect said this, is he brought this moral clarity that almost no one else in the movement had, except, Dr. King maybe. So I see him as a very important figure in that time, but I'm not the only one. And also everyone in the movement who was active knew him and knew of him, and the many, what we call foot soldiers of the movement, most of them were trained by Reverend Lawson in nonviolent direct action, which is, after all, what we call the civil rights movement. It's the way they won the many campaigns. What we forget when people dismiss nonviolence, and they do, and I understand it, and Reverend Lawson understood it, but they miss that it actually succeeds. More times than not, it succeeds. It fails, but it succeeds. It won in Montgomery. It won in Nashville, which Reverend Lawson was the main instigator and organizer of the Nashville campaign. That was the first time that a southern city was desegregated and the signs were taken down. It won in Birmingham. It won in the Freedom Ride. It won in Memphis in the sanitation strike. So he is the architect, as John Lewis said, of the nonviolent movement of America. He didn't like saying the civil rights movement. He would call it the nonviolent movement of America, or he would call it the Rosa Parks Martin Luther King movement. And he put Rosa Parks first because he was very conscious as well, and more so than many other men in the movement, of the role of women and the importance of letting women, not letting, but of women leading. And Black women led in the Nashville movement. Diane Nash, he was responsible for bringing her in and also lifting her up, and other women in the movement, and making, they led. Every day there was a different leader. That was one of the tactics they used. They didn't have one iconic leader in that campaign. And so Reverend Lawson was very forward thinking, very current actually, and just a incredible example of how you live a life. He lived 95 years with a commitment to what he and Reverend Dr. King called the beloved community. So, and then you asked how I know him. I have known Reverend Lawson since I was 5 years old.
Wow.
I grew up in Memphis. Our family moved to Memphis when I was young from New York, but I grew up there. And actually, my mother and Mrs. Lawson first met in 1965, a year after we had moved there, and they had been there like 2 or 3 years. And they were in a group called the Saturday Lunch Club, which was a group of women, Black and white women, who simply went to lunch together on Saturdays at restaurants around Memphis to test the new Civil Rights Act. And sometimes they didn't get admitted. Sometimes they got stares. There were a lot of things, but that was an act of revolution at that time. It was a very radical act at that time. And my mother was one of the few white people, I think, because she was not Southern and did not come from the South. It was maybe something that she was able to do and recognize that, and so did it. Mm-hmm. And then my father and Reverend Lawson knew each other. My father and mother were both journalists, and they, in 1968, when the sanitation strike happened, they actually started, within a couple of weeks, an oral history of the movement. They documented the campaign that led to the sanitation strike that was 65 days, that led to the assassination. And they documented that entire time in Memphis through an oral history. And then my father, we had moved to Memphis because my father was made the head of the film and television department at the University of Memphis. And so he knew all of the news directors at the stations in town, and all of those stations had been filming, the strike and all of the politics around it and all the press conferences. So he went to them and said, can we have the film? Can the university have the film, and we'll preserve it? Because otherwise they would have thrown it away. So there's 25 hours of film. There's, I think it's 400 hours of audio tape and interviews that were done contemporaneously from 68 to 72, that my parents spearheaded that project. And, I grew up around that. Yeah. So if you wonder how I became a journalist,
right.
And then when I did grow up, I became a journalist, and I started covering the South for the New York Times. I was based in Memphis, but I was all over the South. And I interviewed Reverend Lawson a couple of times during that for various things. He lived in LA by then, but he was back here working on similar issues. And then in 2018, I produced a 10-part series for The Root called 1,300 Men. And it is a 10-part series about the sanitation workers who went on strike, the 1,300 Black sanitation workers who had grown up on plantations, they and their wives. And I interviewed them. I interviewed surviving sanitation workers, their wives, and their children. And that was sort of a piece that had been missing and is always missing from that story, is the men and the people, the families who Dr. King died for, right? That's who they were. And in that, the only non-sanitation worker family person that I interviewed was Reverend Lawson, and we reconnected. And then in 2020, I was talking to him on the phone, and I said, have you ever thought about doing your memoir? And he said, my family's been trying to get me to do that for decades. And I said, well, I would love to work with you on it. We talked about it. He had to consult with his family, and he went, and his, as I said, or I think I said, his son and I went to elementary school together in Memphis. So I had known all of them forever. And I guess I got they told me it was a unanimous vote, but the only real important vote was Mrs. Lawson, and she approved. And so we began working, and it was during the pandemic. So we were home, and he was in Los Angeles, I was in Memphis, and we began talking on the phone almost every week or a couple of times a week for really 2-3 years. And we worked on this book, and unfortunately he died before it came out, but we had done most of the work of the interviews, but I finished it out. But that's probably the worst part, is that he wasn't here to see the actual book. But the thing about Reverend Lawson that I think is really important, and then we can take it from there, is his life, his 95 years on Earth. He was born in 1928. He died in 2024. It's a trajectory from Jim Crow through the civil rights movement and segregation, the civil rights movement, through to now, right? Through Reverend Lawson was involved with Black Lives Matter. He worked with undocumented students in LA, and he worked with undocumented workers and farm workers in Los Angeles and California. In 2003, he helped organize a immigrant freedom ride from 11 buses from all over the country went to DC and New York. And in 2003 in New York, he was speaking before an audience, and he said, no human being is illegal. And so he was on top of the issues. In fact, his son, if you get the book, I'm telling you the epilogue, but at the end of the book, his son wrote an afterword, I guess it is, and said that the day before he died, he was watching the 2024 student protests against the Gaza, and he said to his son, I've got to get up out of this hospital bed. I got to go start a new student movement, the day before he died. So his life is an example of someone who was wholly committed and had one of the strongest moral compasses I've ever seen.
Right. I mean, like you say, his work never ended. And obviously he saw all of that as a continuum, right? I mean, these are all struggles for freedom, struggles for justice.
I mean, he got to live 56 more years than Dr. King. As I said, they were the same age. And I think that the work he did in those 56 years against police brutality, for economic justice, equal education, immigrants' rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, he was involved in all of that. And he did that until the day he died. And so his life is a trajectory of the movement that I think we and your audience are committed to. And he's a great example because he was so open-minded, surprisingly. I think people think, the ministers of the civil rights movement are sort of old men. But I mean, he was more progressive than a lot of young people at 94. And he was always, always urging young people and encouraging young people to be radical, to be who they are, to be what they are, and to understand. He would say it this way, I'm not religious, which is interesting because I worked with him on this, but he would say, we are all God's children. And he truly, truly believed that everyone had a right to what he called the gift of life. And he saw people that way. And it was kind of incredible because I don't think in this era now, we really emphasize seeing everyone as valid, seeing everyone's, as worthy of what he would call God's love, what I would call maybe respect. Right. So it's, again, I'm a different generation as well, but what I learned from him was timeless. I found myself at one point after working with him for a year or so, and a friend of mine was having a issue with somebody, someone they loved, and they were angry, and we were talking about it, and what do they do? And I said to them, well, I think you just need to ask, what would love do? Mm-hmm. And then I realized, oh my goodness, that's what Reverend Lawson would say.
You're speaking his language.
Yeah. And I had learned that, and I had internalized it, and it helped me so much in this moment. It helped me, and it helped my friend, because my friend did love this person, but they were angry, and that's how I think he saw love operating in what we call the movement, or in the struggle is another thing that people call it, but we certainly are in the middle of this now, and it's very hard. It's not easy. People think that's a, wishy-washy sort of touchy-feely thing. No, that is the hardest work. That is the hardest work, to really approach with the kind of love and care for yourself, first of all, for your community. And then the hardest part is for the people who are oppressing you. And that does not mean that you in any way let up with the resistance or the anger or anything like that, but you don't become them. He would say, you can't imitate your oppressor. And that nonviolence was a method, a philosophy, a tactic. It was all of those things. But he called it a sort of scientific method and a tool to do that. To, instead of cruelty and instead of domination and violence, that you look for collaboration, mutual aid, we call it now, I think, as well as many other things. And the idea that lifting all boats, is the way to go.
So, I mean, you've hit on this a bit, but I mean, obviously you were working on this with him at a particular time. I mean, the early 2020s, essentially, in a moment that he was obviously still very engaged and aware politically and culturally. What do you think was important to him about telling his story at this moment? What do you think he wanted to convey? Because, this obviously is not just a sort of museum curio of things that happened 50, 60 years ago. It's presenting a life that spans all of this. What do you think his hopes were for this book?
Well, I asked him at the beginning, what do you want this book to do? And he said, I want it to show how a person, a community, a city, a state, nation, the world can transform. Because if you ask what his hopes are, he believed that people can transform, that systems can transform, that nations can transform. He wholly believed that. And that was the sort of vision that kept him going. And I think it's the vision that kept Dr. King going. And he believed that there was a better way. That's what his mother taught him when he was young. And if you read the book, the first line in the book is, I smacked a white kid in the face when I was 4 years old. So we thought it was great to start a book called Nonviolent with him smacking a kid in the face, right? Yeah. Because he, as he would say, he was brought up in the same way as all Americans, with the idea that violence is the supreme power, and that cruelty and domination, I keep saying that, but that's what we're going through now, is the supreme power. And his mother was the first who really said, there has to be a different way, a better way. And he continued to, the kid that he slapped had called him the N-word. And then that happened a number of times for him growing up, as for many people. And then at 8, he did it again. And for the first time, he told his mother. And his mother said, Jimmy, what good did that do? Uh-huh. And that question was seminal for him. That was the moment. And she said, there has to be a better way. And he said from that moment on, he didn't do that. And then there's a scene when he's 12 and the same thing happens. He's in the small town in Ohio, and this kid is in the car and says the N-word. He shouts it at him. So he walked over to him and he introduced himself and he shook his hand and he started talking to him. And he said, my goal was to make him see that I'm a human being. And that, I don't think he felt that was his obligation. He just sort of did it as a practice, not because he felt he was supposed to change white people. Not at all.
Right.
It was more that within himself, that was him fighting back in a different way, right? And so no matter what that kid did, he did that. And so I think, as you see that and it evolves, and he ends up going to prison in college because he resisted the draft because he thought the selective service was racist. And it is. It was sending black men disproportionately to war, and it still is.
That was the Korean War, right?
Yeah, the Korean War.
A draft resistor.
And so, well, he wasn't a draft resistor. That's the thing. He wasn't a draft resistor. He wasn't a conscientious objector. He refused to cooperate with the selective service, which is a little different. And I mean, I'm sorry to be that, pedantic, but he was very concerned with the difference, the nuances, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of them, is that he could have gotten a ministerial excusal because he was already had his minister's license. He could have become a conscientious objector and done community service, but he said, no, I believe this entire system is wrong, and so I will not be a part of it. And he sent his draft card back knowing that he would be arrested. And he was arrested, and then they put him on trial, and they said they were going to make him an example. And so they did, and he was sent to federal prison, which the federal prison that he served in was the same federal prison that 20 years before Bayard Rustin had served in during World War II for the exact same thing. So that was his mentor. And then Muhammad Ali in the Vietnam War did the exact same thing. And he said he met Muhammad Ali, but he said Muhammad Ali did me a great favor because he kind of legitimized what I had done. Right. And so that's the tradition that he's a part of, and that's a pretty good one. Bayard Rustin and Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, for sure.
And so he's a lot, I don't know how to say this any other way, but he's a lot cooler than I think people would expect from a icon of the civil rights movement or a leader of the civil rights movement. He's iconic within the movement, maybe, as you said, not outside the movement, but he's also iconic in the labor movement. Because his part, if you look at the Memphis sanitation strike, which was in 1968, the 1,300 men who went on strike, black men who had grown up on plantations. And this was the first time that the labor movement and racial justice movement came together, really. Because before that, labor unions really had excluded black people and people who were not white and women, everybody except white men. And essentially, that's a pretty simplistic view of it, but essentially that's what it was. And then when he moved to LA in the 70s and then into the 80s, and in the 80s in LA, he worked with labor unions. He worked with just for SEIU, the service workers, which was a campaign called Justice for Janitors, which is very related to the Memphis sanitation strike. He worked with service workers in hotels and the various unions in LA, mainly immigrant workers, and not just Latino, but predominantly Latino, but also people from other parts of the world who came as immigrants to America and worked in these service jobs, and they didn't have rights, and they were treated, as he saw, just as the sanitation workers were treated in Memphis, and as the sanitation workers were standing up because they were being treated like they had been treated on plantations in Mississippi. And so he saw that trajectory, and his life connects those things so that we understand how we got here. And he coined a term, which I'm just kind of going on here, but he coined a term, plantation capitalism. And he felt that that's what we're living in now. And, if you look at it, it's sort of self-explanatory, but he got the term plantation from the Memphis sanitation workers. When they came to Memphis and started working for the city, the public works department, they called it the plantation. And they called the place, the building where the trucks left, they called it the barn. Because it echoed the plantation and the bad working conditions, the poor pay, the treatment from, the racialized treatment, mistreatment. And so he saw that happening over and over again. And he had a real beef with capitalism because of what it does to people and how it doesn't address, poverty is a symptom of capitalism.
Right.
We live in the richest country in the world, and Memphis, for instance, where I live, the poverty rate in Memphis is pretty much exactly the same as it was in 1968 when Dr. King died for those men.
Right. And still heavily greater for the Black community.
African Americans. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that is by choice. That is nothing but a choice that we have made. And we, as all of us, our society, our country, our government. And that is a choice. And it is a choice that Reverend Lawson said could change and could be transformed. And that's what he believed in. So, arguments about nonviolence versus violence, or, that nonviolence is an old tactic. It's not a big deal. It's nothing. I'm angry. I'm going to be violent. He sort of saw that as a very American response. He said when he and Stokely Carmichael, as he was called in the 60s, and then he went on and changed his name and was Kwame Ture, but we used the name that people had when they were in the moment. So when we were writing about the 60s, it was Stokely Carmichael. And people act like Stokely Carmichael was Black Power and Martin Luther King was nonviolence, and they had this huge rift, and that was the big... Well, there's a couple of things. One is they all were friends. They knew each other. There's pictures in the book we put deliberately in of them all laughing together during the March Against Fear, where they had the difference between Black Power and nonviolence. And so Reverend Lawson said, I never spoke out publicly against anyone who was fighting the same fight I was fighting, even if they didn't believe in the same way to get there. You know, he said, I believed very strongly in the way to get there was the way of nonviolence, but he understood they were feeling the same things he was feeling, and they were fighting for the same thing he was fighting. And he just believed very strongly that nonviolence was successful, where he said he felt nonviolence and the ideas behind it, the philosophy, the goals, the way you have to be in the world, and the discipline and the training that it took was more radical than the idea of just getting guns and fighting back. Because his belief was only more violence leads to more violence. And nonviolence can lead to a different outcome. It's not as satisfying as the idea of punching the kid in the face, right? But in the long run, he felt that way was, well, he would say that it takes the same kind of commitment, it takes the same kind of training, it takes the same kind of tactical and strategic thinking as the military. But if you look at the sort of outcome, the ultimate outcome of militarism and violence is war. The ultimate outcome of nonviolence and mutual aid is the beloved community. So which do you want?
And I think, like, you talk about it being radical, and I think sort of for those of us who grew up in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the idea of nonviolence is kind of, it's already been established, and we maybe accept it as, that's what they did, and here's why it worked. But really, before the 20th century, it was not something with a long and tried history. I mean, obviously, Gandhi's movement was hugely influential on King and Reverend Lawson, like you're saying. But as organized nonviolence at a mass level is a pretty revolutionary idea still.
Yeah, and I think that in America, it hasn't ever actually been sustained. And that's not necessarily because it can't be, it's because of what we're up against. Reverend Lawson would say, he believed, and I've come to believe too, this is the most violent country in the history of the world, nation in the history of the world. And I mean, you can look at a lot of things, but if all you do is look at, we're the only nation that's ever dropped an atomic bomb, and we have more guns than humans in this country. Yeah. So just that alone is a little bit of evidence. He would talk, and I think this gets pretty deep, but I actually think it's so insightful. He said there are the three, he would say there are three original sins. There are more, but he would emphasize these three original sins of this country. And obviously the plundering and exploitation and colonialism of Native American lands, indigenous people's lands, and then the kidnapping of people from Africa, bringing them to this country and working for no pay for so long. And then all of what comes after that in terms of Jim Crow and school to prison pipeline and police brutality, all of that. And then the third one, he said, was a spirituality that justifies burning women at the stake. Mm-hmm. And I think what was so interesting about that is, and a friend of mine said it really well, he said, we certainly know about the first two, but we sort of think of the witch trials and all of that as a little novelty of history.
Right.
And he said, but if you really look at it and you look at now and you look at, we can't seem to have a woman be president. We just can't seem to handle it. One of the only countries in the West that hasn't done that. And the way that, he felt very strongly about women being leaders. And I asked him about that, obviously. And I said, where did that come from? And he said, well, I had 5 older sisters growing up. He was a family of 9 kids. He was the oldest boy, and there were 5 girls and 4 boys. The 5 girls came first, then the 4 boys. And he said that was part of it. But also it comes back to this idea that he really embraced and believed, which was that every human being has the right to access to the gift of life. That's how he would say it. And I like that. At first I thought it sounded a little, preachery. Yeah. But if you think about what that means and what he's saying there is that there's no reason except man-made, human-made reasons for people not to have that. Right. And to not believe that. And that the idea of supremacy and all of those things are things we don't want to keep continuing. We don't want to continue doing. And there are things that we don't want to imitate in fighting against and dismantling those systems. We don't want to just dismantle those systems and put a similar one in place, that has some other supremacies in it. Right. And so that, I think, was such an interesting take on it. And there's a chapter in the book toward the end called Plantation Capitalism. And it's where whenever we talked, we'd have these long talks and we'd be talking about something happening in 1968 or, 72. And suddenly he'd start talking about the current president or, he was very much, people say, oh, what would he say now? And I said, well, we don't have to look very far because he only died a year and a half ago,
right.
And during the insurrection on January 6th, he compared it. I talked to him soon after that, and he was very upset, but also very sort of calm. And he said it reminded him of Birmingham in 1963, right before Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy decided to march, knowing they would be arrested, and that's when they were arrested, put in jail, and letter from Birmingham jail came. And he said it reminded him of the meeting they had that morning, where all of the leaders were in the hotel room, the Gaston Motel in Birmingham, and in King's Room, which was sort of the ground zero headquarters of the movement in Birmingham. And they started talking about, he said somebody in the room said, we should go to Washington. We should storm Congress. And he said they had the idea of doing this.
Right.
And they realized, in that moment that the other way to do it was what they did. What they did, right, not just marching, though, a whole strategy of going to jail and sending so many people to jail that the authorities don't know what to do and wanting to be arrested, and then going to jail and writing that letter and getting it out to the public and having he considered marches and all of those things. He called them demonstrations. He never called them protests. They weren't reactive. They were demonstrating the issue, the problem, to the greater public. It was to educate people. Mm-hmm. So sit-ins weren't just because they wanted coffee at the lunch counter or a hamburger. It was because that was a way to show the world what they went through.
Yeah.
what they had to live with and what they were up against. And when that was revealed, change came. And that was, the next year they had the Civil Rights Act and many other things. And again, these are all steps. They never saw taking down the signs and getting the Civil Rights Act as their goal. That was just step one. And we're maybe in step two right now,
right.
And when Reverend Lawson turned 90, he said, I realized I wasn't going to see this, And so now it's up to us.
Yeah.
And I take that very seriously. He at one point called me a second generation social justice journalist. And I was like, wow, I think I can retire now, but I can't because the day before he died. Right. So I think we all now are carrying on the work that he and others did. And so separating ourselves and calling that the old thing and all of that is just not, it seems sort of silly to me. Right. We're all in the same fight. And again, I'm white, and I said this early, but I'll say this again. Fannie Lou Hamer is one of my heroes. And what she said, nobody's free till everybody's free. I believe that. I'm not free when there is racial oppression or oppression of anyone, and certainly not of women. But, all of that is part of building a world that does not yet exist. That's the end. I just gave away the last line of the book, which is join us in building a world that does not yet exist.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what he saw nonviolence as a way to do that. And I think it's more important to focus on that vision than on the tactics of getting there. And a commitment to that vision is the point.
Right. Well, honestly, I could ask you a bunch more questions, but I think that's a really good place to wrap it up. The sense that, this is the fight goes on, the struggles go on, and that, it is remarkable to have a figure who just spanned the time that you're talking about and was able to have that kind of perspective on, almost a century of American life.
Yeah, and he didn't become a politician. He kept being an organizer. He kept being a pastor. He was very committed to that. And, what the tactics and everything, that's in the book. The way that they did it in Nashville, how they organized the movement, the trainings, he trained thousands of people. His son and I have gone around as the book came out in February, and people come up to us in Washington, D.C. Somebody came up and said, I was in a training with Reverend Lawson in 1994 and it changed my life. And somebody else says, he spoke to me for 5 minutes and it changed my life, because he was spreading the same message, tactics, goals, visions from the movement, but they are still, as we all know, relevant, and it's still the issues we're dealing with today. And so I hope that for me, as the co-author, this book is in Reverend Lawson's words. It's not a biography. It's in his words, but I helped him as a writer make it into a book. And what I hope is that this book can be useful to people who want to see the kind of world that his life was committed to creating with many, many others. And the stories in it are just incredible.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your work on the book, and for maybe prodding him to take the step to actually do it, because obviously we wouldn't have it otherwise. And thanks a lot for talking about it. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And it's great to have this opportunity to talk to people in the South. I love it.
Yeah,
I don't have to explain the South.
Well, we're all trying to explain the South, right?
Right. And I mean, also the progressiveness in the South, and the idea that this was a Southern movement and it changed the country. And I don't think it was given credit in that way. We think I think in the national psyche, the Southerners are thought of as white racists, which is absolutely true.
Sure.
But it's also Black people leading a movement with some white people and others, but leading a movement that changed the world, and that still is. It's still happening in the South.
Right. All right. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
Fans of old-time music, bluegrass, and Americana probably don't need me to tell you this, but this weekend is MerleFest in North Carolina, specifically on the campus of Wilkes Community College in Wilkesboro. The festival was started in 1988 by the late guitar-picking legend Doc Watson in tribute to his son Merle. Merle Watson grew up playing music with his father, and the two were close collaborators until Merle died in a farm accident in 1985 at the age of 36. He ended up pinned beneath a tractor after it slid down an embankment. MerleFest is an annual fundraiser for Wilkes Community College, which is only about 20 miles from the Watson family farm in Deep Gap, North Carolina. Over the years, it has grown to draw more than 75,000 people, with a local economic impact of more than $10 million. It draws artists from a range of genres that Doc Watson called traditional plus: old-time string bands, country, blues, roots rock, Cajun music, Celtic music, and more. Dolly Parton and Willie Nelson have played it, as have Robert Plant and Elvis Costello. Doc Watson died in 2012, but the festival has continued in its mission to support the college and the local community. This year's lineup includes Alison Krauss, Old Crow Medicine Show, Molly Tuttle, and dozens more. You can buy 4-day or 1-day passes with add-ons for camping, RV parking, and the ever-popular Saturday late-night jam. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit enterprise, and you can find information about supporting us on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. You can also reach out to me directly at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. Thanks to our friends in Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.